In the middle of 1943, the war in the Pacific wasn't just a fight against the Japanese Empire, it was a fight against the map itself. Geography was the enemy. Northern Australia was the edge of the world. Fenton Airfield was less a military base and more a scar carved into red dust and scrub brush. It was a place where the heat felt like a physical weight pressing on your chest. The sun baked the aluminum skins of the bombers until you could fry an egg on the wings. The flies were thick enough to choke on. But the worst part wasn't the heat or the insects. It was the distance. The targets were thousands of miles away across an ocean that didn't care whether you lived or died. If an engine quit, you didn't glide to a field. You fell into shark-infested water and vanished. The men stationed at Fenton were part of the 380th Bomb Group. They called themselves the Lone Rangers because nobody else was willing to operate that far out. They flew the consolidated B-24 Liberator. To the public back home. The Liberator was a symbol of American strength, a four-engine heavy bomber designed to carry tons of high explosives deep into enemy territory. It was supposed to be a flying fortress, bristling with machine guns and protected by heavy armor. But the crews knew the truth. The Liberator was a flying brick, heavy on the controls, hard to fly, and in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, it was always thirsty. The experts at the factories had written a manual for the B-24. They calculated weight, drag, and fuel consumption. They drew charts that told pilots exactly what the plane could do. According to the book, the Liberator had a combat radius of about 800 miles. That meant 800 miles out, drop your bombs, and 800 miles back. A respectable distance in Europe where targets lay just across the channel. But in the Pacific, 800 miles was nothing. It barely reached the enemy's front porch. The real targets, the ones that mattered, were far beyond the red line on the charts. The biggest prize was Balikpapan, a city on Borneo and the beating heart of the Japanese war machine. It was a vast oil refinery complex producing a massive share of the aviation fuel used by the Japanese Air Force. Every Zero that shot down an American plane, every bomber that attacked Allied ships, burned fuel refined at Balikpapan. The American generals studied the map and understood that if they could burn Balikpapan, they could strangle the enemy. They could turn Japanese aircraft into grounded scrap. But there was a problem. Balikpapan was 2,600 miles away. Roughly the distance from London to Moscow and back. To fly that far, a B-24 would need to stay airborne for 17 hours. The experts did the math. They examined fuel capacity, bomb weight, crew weight, ammunition, and armor. The equation failed. Load enough fuel to reach the target and you couldn't carry bombs. Carry bombs and you would run out of gas hundreds of miles short of home. It was a mathematical stalemate. The Japanese commanders understood this math as well as anyone. They felt safe. Balikpapan was considered a sanctuary. They barely enforced blackouts at night. Refinery lights blazed, illuminating the complex like a carnival. They didn't assign their best fighter squadrons to defend it because they believed the Pacific Ocean was a stronger shield than any gun. They mocked the Americans, calling them short-legged. They operated at full capacity, confident that physics was on their side. But the men of the 380th were tired of the math. They were tired of bombing meaningless jungle strips while the true target pumped oil untouched. They looked at their bombers and saw wasted potential. They began asking dangerous questions. Why carry so much armor if no one would be shooting until the target? Why keep belly turrets for night missions? They began seeing safety features not as protection but as dead weight. This was where expert doctrine clashed with frontline reality. Engineers insisted the armor, self-sealing tanks, and heavy turrets were essential. They called the B-24 survivable because it could absorb punishment. But the crews at Fenton realized survivability meant nothing if you couldn't reach the objective. They decided the best armor wasn't steel. It was distance. If you could fly farther than the enemy expected and strike where he wasn't looking, you didn't need to endure return fire. So they began what became known as skeleton modifications. It wasn't official. It wasn't sanctioned. It was a backlit project carried out by sweaty mechanics and determined pilots under the cover of the Australian night. They approached the bombers with wrenches and started unbolting the very things meant to save their lives. They removed heavy armor plates and left them in the grass. They stripped out waste guns and ammunition crates. Then they tackled the machinery. The Sperry Ball turret, a 1,000-pound spherical gun platform hanging from the belly, was unbolted and lowered to the tarmac. The gaping hole it left behind was covered with plywood. They turned a fortified bomber into a hollow aluminum shell. Engineers would have called it suicide. A B-24 without armor was a flying fuel can wrapped in foil. 120mm cannon shell could rip it apart. Without the belly turret, it was defenseless from below. Without armor, the pilots were exposed. Removing the turrets even reduced structural rigidity, making the aircraft flex and shudder. But they didn't stop there. They removed seats, relief tubes, and anything that wasn't fuel or bombs. Then they went further. They installed auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay. Often improvised, connected with rubber hoses and clamps, they turned the bomb bay into a reservoir of high-octane gasoline. This left space for only a handful of bombs. A normal load might be 4,000 pounds of explosives. The skeleton ships could carry 3 or 4 500-pound bombs. It sounded absurd to fly 17 hours for so little. But the crews understood it wasn't about quantity. It was about placement. 1 bomb in a refinery cracking tower could do more damage than 1,000 in the jungle. When finished, the planes looked wrong. They sat high on their landing gear when empty. The wind whistled through gaps where turrets once. Saturday the crews joked and called them skeletons or paper planes. But behind the humor was resolve. They were about to break the leash. The night of the first mission, the airfield was silent. The crews climbed into hollowed-out aircraft reeking of gasoline. They were perched atop thousands of gallons of fuel with nothing but thin aluminum between them and oblivion. The runway felt short with the added fuel. The aircraft were heavier than rated limits. The center of gravity had shifted, aerodynamics were compromised. Experts would have predicted failure, but the engines roared to life. Propellers blurred silver. The Lone Rangers taxied forward, brakes protesting. Under the load, they advanced the throttles. The skeleton bombers lumbered down the runway, using every inch to lift into the dark. They clawed upward and turned north, toward the equator, toward an impossible distance, and toward a Japanese base sleeping peacefully under refinery lights. Once airborne, the mission became a battle against the ocean. The route to Balikpapan was a tightrope over the Timor Sea and the Makassar Strait, endless stretches of unforgiving water. For the stripped liberators, the ocean was a greater threat than enemy fighters. If shot down, the end was quick. If forced to ditch, it was a slow wait in shark-filled waters, and an aircraft stripped for range. There were no rafts, no survival kits, only crew and fuel. The first hours tested nerves. The insulation had been removed with the armor. As they climbed to conserve fuel, the temperature inside plummeted. At 10,000 feet it was freezing. 15,000 it was well below zero. Wind shrieked through patched openings. Plywood belly covers rattled violently. The men huddled in flight gear, flying a convertible in sub-zero air, but cold was secondary. The real enemy was fuel consumption. The mission was a living equation. Pilots leaned engines carefully, reducing fuel flow to the minimum required to keep them running. Too lean and pistons would melt. Not lean enough and they'd flame out. Short of home. Cylinder head temperatures were watched obsessively. They listened for a cough or sputter, signs of pushing too far. They were driving on empty for 17 straight hours in the bomb bay. The danger was even more immediate. Auxiliary tanks improvised in the belly weren't factory secured. Some crews carried 55-gallon drums of aviation fuel and a hand pump. When wing tanks ran low, the flight engineer crawled back, opened a drum, and manually pumped gasoline into the system mid-flight. Imagine doing this at 15,000 feet in a vibrating metal tube while being battered by turbulence. The smell of high-octane gas filled the fuselage. The fumes were so thick they made the crew dizzy. 1 spark, a static discharge from a radio, a stray bullet, or a boot scuffing a metal bolt wouldn't just start a fire. It would turn the bomber into a thermobaric bomb. The plane would vaporize instantly. The men worked in slow motion, terrified of making a mistake. They were riding on top of a flying bomb, pouring explosives into the engines by hand. As they crossed the coastline of the Dutch East Indies, the sun began to set. The Pacific turned from brilliant blue to deep, menacing black. Navigation became the next nightmare. In 1943, there was no GPS, there were no satellite uplinks. The navigator had to rely on dead reckoning. This meant calculating position based on speed, time, and direction while estimating how much the wind was pushing them off course. Over the open ocean, there were no landmarks. No road signs. If the wind shifted 5 degrees and the navigator didn't catch it, the plane would miss Borneo entirely. They would fly into endless darkness until the engines quit. The navigators worked by the light of dim bulbs, scribbling on charts with pencils, checking the stars through the astrodome. They carried the weight of the crew's survival on their shoulders. A math error of 1% meant death. They checked and rechecked their figures. Sweating in the freezing cold, they stared down at the dark water, searching for whitecaps to judge wind speed. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, and the haystack was the size of the United States. While the Americans fought the elements, the Japanese at Balikpapan were enjoying a peaceful night. The base commander at the refinery felt secure that he had studied the same charts as the Americans. He knew the nearest American bomber base was in Australia, far beyond the maximum range of a B-24 to him. The war was something happening far away on the front lines in New Guinea or the Solomon Islands. Balikpapan was rear echelon. It was the Empire's gas station, safe and untouchable. This arrogance became the Americans' greatest weapon. Because the Japanese believed an attack was impossible, they didn't establish a perimeter. They had no radar stations sweeping the southern approaches, no combat air patrols at night. They didn't even turn off the lights as the skeleton bombers approached Borneo. The pilots saw something they hadn't seen in months. A glow on the horizon. At first they thought it was the moon rising, but as they drew closer, the glow resolved into individual lights. It was the city of Balikpapan. It was the refinery. The Japanese had left the streetlights on. They had left the factory lights blazing. The cracking towers burned off excess gas, sending huge flares of orange fire into the sky. It looked like a birthday cake in the dark. To pilots who had spent hours flying in pitch-black skies, squinting at red instrument panels, it was shocking. It was an insult. The enemy was so confident, so certain of their safety, that they hadn't bothered to pull the blinds. The formation broke radio silence only to confirm the target. They lined up for the approach. The skeleton planes were lighter now. They had burned off thousands of pounds of fuel during the long flight. They felt different on the controls, more responsive, almost jumpy. They were no longer heavy trucks. They were hollow shells carrying a few deadly packages. The pilots checked speed. They checked altitude. They were coming in at 8,000 feet. Usually a bomber approach meant a gauntlet of flak and searchlights. The crews braced for the trap. The moment when beams crossed in the sky, blinding pilots and marking them for anti-aircraft guns. They waited for black puffs of exploding shells. They waited for tracers to arc upward like angry fireflies. But nothing happened. The Japanese gunners were asleep in their barracks. The searchlight operators were playing cards or smoking cigarettes. They heard the drone of engines overhead but didn't panic. They assumed it was Japanese transport planes arriving from the Philippines. It never occurred to them that it could be Americans. The sound of a B-24 engine is distinct, a deep throbbing rumble. But if you believe a B-24 cannot fly that far, your mind tells you it must be something else. It was a psychological blind spot. The Americans were hiding inside the enemy's own assumptions. The bombardiers in the noses of the skeleton planes peered through their Norden bomb sights. They could hardly believe their luck. Usually bombing was a game of probability. You dropped through clouds, through smoke, or while dodging shrapnel and hoped to hit something important. Tonight they had a stationary target lit up like a billboard. They could pick out individual buildings. They saw massive circular oil storage tanks arranged in neat rows. They saw distillation towers, the tangled pipes of the refinery, the docks where tankers loaded. It was target-rich. It was a bomber's dream. They made small adjustments to their sights, lining up the crosshairs. The planes drifted steady and smooth, no turbulence, no flak to throw off the aim. It felt like a training flight back home. The lead pilot held the aircraft steady. Fighting the urge to speed up, he had to give the bombardier a stable platform. He watched the target slide beneath the nose and the bomb bays. The auxiliary fuel tanks were empty now, hollow metal drums still smelling of gas. The real payload waited. The bomb bay doors groaned open. Wind roared into the fuselage, swirling fumes and deepening the cold. The crew held their breath. This was the moment. This was why they stripped the armor. This was why they risked sharks, cold, and fire. They were about to deliver a wake-up call to the Japanese Empire. The lead bombardier pressed the release. The plane lurched upward as the weight fell away. A string of 500-pound bombs tumbled into the dark, whistling as they dropped. They weren't just releasing explosives. They were sending a message. They were proving the map was wrong. Proving there was no safe distance. Below, the Japanese shift workers went about their routines, checking gauges, turning valves, moving oil from tanks to ships. They felt protected by the ocean. Then the first bomb hit. The explosion was seismic. It struck an oil storage tank. The tank didn't merely rupture. It disintegrated. Thousands of gallons of crude oil atomized and ignited instantly. A fireball the size of a city block erupted, turning night into noon. The ground shook. The shock wave shattered windows across the complex. Then the second bomb hit, then the third. The refinery became an inferno. Orderly rows of tanks turned into a chain reaction of destruction. Burning oil flooded the facility like rivers of lava. Distillation towers crumpled like soda cans. The garrison woke to the sound of the world ending. Air raid sirens began to wail, minutes too late. Gunners ran to positions half-dressed, staring skyward in confusion. They couldn't see the planes. They saw only fire. They shot wildly into the air. Tracers zipped upward, aiming at nothing. They assumed carrier planes were attacking. They believed a U.S. Navy fleet had slipped close to shore. They couldn't conceive that land-based bombers had flown from Australia. They searched for dive bombers coming in low. They didn't look up to 8,000 feet where the skeletons were already turning for home. The Americans watched the fires behind them. The glow was so bright they could read maps by it in the cockpit. They had struck the heart. But as adrenaline faded, reality returned. They were still over Borneo. Still 2,600 miles from home, and now the Japanese were awake. The easy part was over. Now came the escape. The skeleton planes were lighter without bombs and much of the fuel, but they were deep in enemy territory. Japanese fighter squadrons at nearby fields were scrambling, Zeros lifted off, angry and hunting. They would be searching for slow, heavy bombers. The skeleton crews knew they had no belly. Turret and waist guns and armor. If a Zero caught them, they were finished. The pilots pushed throttles forward, trying to gain speed, trying to widen the gap from the hornet's nest they had stirred. They headed south toward the dark ocean, toward cold and silence. Euphoria faded into dread. They had 17 hours to think about what would happen if fighters found them or if fuel calculations were off by a few gallons. The paper planes had delivered their blow. Now they had to survive. The turn away from Balikpapan was the most dangerous maneuver the 380th had faced as the skeleton bombers banked south, leaving the burning refinery behind. The sky over Borneo filled with angry bees. Japanese Zero fighters had finally scrambled. The element of surprise, the Americans' only shield, was gone. Now the enemy knew where they were and what they were flying. Japanese radar operators shouted vectors, searching for the heavy bombers that had humiliated them. They wanted revenge in a normal B-24. This was when gunners earned their pay. They would charge .50 caliber machine guns, swivel turrets, and create a box of death around the formation. But the skeleton crews sat in silence. They glanced at empty spaces where waist guns once stood. The plywood patch where the ball turret had hung. They were flying toothless aluminum tubes that if a Zero found them, they couldn't fight back. They could only run. The pilots pushed engines to the red line. The B-24, usually lumbering, now felt fast without bombs and armor. It surged forward, for Pratt and Whitney engines howling in the frozen night. But speed alone wasn't enough. A Zero could still outmaneuver them. Their only hope was darkness. The pilots dropped their noses, diving away from the glow of the fires. They searched for cloud layers, the thickest, darkest cover they could find. They were playing high-stakes hide and seek with men determined to kill them. The crew held their breath, watching the horizon. They saw distant exhaust flames from Japanese fighters. Blue streaks cutting through black sky. The fighters swept the area, lights flicking on and off, searching for a reflective wing or moving shadow. Each time one turned toward them, the Americans flinched. They gripped bulkheads, waiting for the ripping sound of 20mm cannons tearing through thin aluminum. They felt naked. They were flying through a shark tank wearing a suit made of meat. But the Pacific night is a big place. The Japanese fighters were searching for a standard bomber formation at a standard altitude. They weren't looking for stripped-down hot rods diving into cloud tops. The skeletons slipped through the net. They vanished into the mist, leaving confused and furious Japanese pilots circling the burning refinery like hornets around a shattered nest. The Americans had pulled off the heist. Now they just had to survive the getaway as the adrenaline faded. A colder reality set in. They were safe from fighters, but not from math. They were still 2,000 miles from Australia. The flight computers, tired men with pencils and slide rules, began crunching numbers. The results were terrifying. The high-speed escape had guzzled fuel. The engines had been running rich, drinking gasoline faster than the mission plan allowed. Fuel needles were dropping too quickly. The Lone Rangers settled in for the long haul. The thrill of the bombing run gave way to crushing boredom and quiet terror. This was the 17-hour war. It wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with valves and pumps. The auxiliary bomb bay tanks were their lifeline. The flight engineers had to transfer that fuel into the main wing tanks. In a factory-built plane, you flip a switch. In a skeleton bomber, you work. The engineers crawled into the bomb bay. It was a freezing, wind-blown cavern. The bay doors were closed, but seals were imperfect. The slipstream roared through cracks. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming. They attached hoses to drums, primed hand pumps, and physically cranked fuel into the system. It was backbreaking labor at 15,000 feet without oxygen masks. They pumped until arms burned. They pumped until heads spun from fumes. They were moving liquid dynamite between containers while riding a vibrating jackhammer. .1 spark. That thought looped in their minds. A loose wire. A static shock from wool. A wrench striking metal. Any of it could turn the plane into a comet. The engineers moved slowly and deliberately, treating each hose connection like bomb disposal. They watched fuel levels rise inch by painful inch. They were buying time, buying distance. Hours passed. The engine drone became tortured at a constant, deafening roar vibrating through bone. Crews began hallucinating. They heard voices in radio static, saw lights that weren't there. Cold seeped into bones. Heating systems had been removed to save weight, turning the fuselage into a refrigerator. Condensation froze on metal ribs. Men stomped feet and slapped arms to keep blood moving. They were exhausted, but sleep meant death. If a pilot nodded off and drifted off course, they would miss Australia. If engineers slept and forgot to switch tanks, engines would quit. Navigators were the busiest men aboard. They fought the drift. Winds over the ocean were unpredictable. A 20-mile-per-hour crosswind could push a plane miles off course each hour over a 10-hour return. That adds up. You could miss the entire continent and fly until Antarctica. The navigators climbed into the Astrodome trying to shoot stars with their sextants, but the clouds hiding them from Japanese fighters also hid the sky. They were flying blind, relying on dead reckoning, trusting old calculations, hoping winds hadn't shifted. They stared at compasses until eyes watered, prayed for breaks in cloud cover. Around 3:00 a.m., the crisis hit on one bomber. The number 3 engine began coughing. Not mechanical failure. Starvation. Fuel flow was uneven. The pilot grabbed mixture control and feathered the prop to reduce drag, but the power loss hit like a wall. The plane yawed violently right. He stomped the rudder to keep it straight. Now they were flying on 3 engines. The math changed instantly. A 3-engine bomber is slower. It burns more fuel because remaining engines work harder. The pilot checked gauges. They trembled near empty. He looked at the navigator. The navigator shook his head. They would be short. They began throwing weight overboard. Waste hatches opened. Empty fuel drums went first. Then heavy machine gun mounts. Then parachutes. A desperate attempt to lighten the load, and by glide distance, they stripped the skeleton to bone. Sunrise crept up behind them. It should have been beautiful golden light over endless blue water. But to them, it was exposure. They were visible again. If a Japanese patrol found them, they were finished. Worse than the enemy was the ocean, stretching forever in every direction. A graveyard of water. Pilots leaned engines out further, running them dangerously lean, trading engine life for miles. They didn't care if engines melted as long as it happened over runway. Gauges touched red, warning lights flickered. The Lone Rangers ran on fumes and willpower. Then a voice crackled over the radio. Faint, buried in static, but unmistakable. It was Fenton Tower. They were picking up the bombers on long-range radio. The signal was weak, but real. They were in range. The navigator checked charts, drew a line. They were close. A dark smudge appeared on the horizon. Not a cloud. It had edges. It was Australia. The crew released a breath they'd been holding for 17 hours. Red dirt, scrub brushed. It looked like Mars, but it was home. Danger wasn't over. Landing a B-24 is hard. Landing one on 3 engines, nearly dry, with an exhausted pilot, is worse. The crippled bomber lined up with runway.no fuel for a go-around. One chance. Landing gear dropped, wheels locked with a heavy thud, drag slowed the aircraft. The pilot fought the stall. Stall warning screamed. He eased the nose down. Runway rushed upward. Too short, he cut power. The bomber dropped. Tires hit dirt with a screech. The plane bounced, rattled, then settled. He stood on brakes. The skeleton groaned and skidded, rolling past tower, past fire trucks. Finally stopping at runway's end, nose while dipping into dirt overrun. Silence. Engines sputtered and died. Props. Stopped turning. The pilot slumped over the yoke. Hands shaking too violently to grip controls, fuel was gone. They had landed dry. 0.5 more minutes in air, and they'd be swimming. One by one. The other skeletons returned, falling from sky like exhausted birds, landing in clouds of red dust. Some taxied in. Others were towed after engines quit on taxiway. Ground crews rushed out, hatches opened. Men stumbled out looking like ghosts. Gray faces smeared with grease and soot. Sunken eyes. They couldn't walk straight. They staggered onto tarmac, legs trembling from 17 hours of vibration and no cheering and no celebration. They collapsed onto solid earth, staring at sky that had tried to kill them. They lit cigarettes with shaking hands, looked at hollow, dented, stripped bombers that carried them to hell and back. The commanding officer arrived in a jeep. He studied exhausted men, empty fuel tanks. Mission reports. He understood. They hadn't just bombed a refinery. They had broken rules. They proved impossible was a word used by people afraid to strip armor. The raid on Balikpapan was a success. Reconnaissance photos days later showed refinery still burning. Smoke plume visible for miles. Japanese production cut in half. But real victory wasn't oil, was fear. Japanese high command panicked. They measured distance on maps that couldn't comprehend how Americans had done it. They realized sanctuary was gone if Balikpapan was reachable. Anything was. The Lone Rangers had changed geography. They shrank the Pacific, but cost was written on young faces lying in dirt at Fenton. They had aged 10 years in one night. They stared into the abyss of the ocean for 17 hours, and it stared back. They survived the skeleton run, but knew tomorrow would bring new targets, new distances, new impossible equations. The war wasn't over. It had only grown longer. The sun was fully up when mechanics at Fenton finally examined the returning machines. In harsh Australian morning light. The skeleton bombers didn't look like conquering heroes. They looked like wrecks dragged from a junkyard. Paint was stripped from the leading edges of the wings, sandblasted by 17 hours of high-speed wind. Fuselages were streaked with oil and exhaust soot. But the most shocking detail was the emptiness visible through the open waste windows. You could see straight through the aircraft, no guns, no ammunition belts. Only hollow space. Plywood patches covering the belly turret openings were warped by moisture and cold. It was a miracle these aluminum tubes had held together at all. The crews stumbling from the hatches looked worse. They moved like old men. Joints locked from sitting in freezing air nearly a full day. Faces hollow, eyes sunken, skin gray and waxy. They had no energy to celebrate, no cheers, no handshakes. They slumped against landing gear tires, lighting cigarettes with hands shaking so badly they could barely hold a match. They stared at the ground, trying to convince their inner ears the world had stopped vibrating. They had run a marathon while strapped to a shaking metal chair, breathing gasoline fumes. The intelligence officers were the only ones energized. They rushed film canisters to the photo lab, desperate for proof the impossible raid had worked. When photographs developed, the mood inside the command tent shifted from anxiety to disbelief. Images showed Balikpapan's refinery burning. Massive smoke plumes rose thousands of feet, visible for miles. Storage tanks were obliterated. Cracking towers twisted into skeletal wreckage. The Lone Rangers had not merely struck the target. They had gutted it. Strategic consequences were immediate. For years Japan had treated Borneo as secure territory. Defenses had been stripped and sent to front lines in New Guinea. Now they understood the front line was everywhere. Safe distance no longer existed. The Japanese high command reacted in panic. They studied maps and realized that if Americans could reach Balikpapan, They could strike shipping lanes in the Java Sea, rubber plantations, and additional oil fields. Fighter squadrons were pulled from combat zones to guard rear areas. Anti-aircraft guns were redeployed from beaches to factories far inland. Millions of gallons of fuel were wasted patrolling empty ocean for bombers that might never come. The skeleton raid forced Japan to defend a territory the size of the United States, stretching resources until defenses thinned dangerously. The modification also proved something uncomfortable. It showed the safety manuals were flawed. Engineers had designed the B-24 as a flying tank, prioritizing armor and guns. They believed steel kept crews alive. At Fenton, the crews proved survival could come from speed, range, and surprise. They demonstrated that a stripped-down aircraft could inflict more damage than a heavily armed fortress. They rewrote principles of long-range bombing. The war, however, did not pause. The 17-hour missions continued. The 380th Bomb Group flew again and again. They struck oil fields, nickel mines, and laid sea mines in Japanese harbors. Each mission was an endurance trial. Aircraft deteriorated. Engines pushed constantly at limits began failing. Airframes stressed by heavy loads without turret support developed cracks. Men deteriorated as well. Human bodies are not built for repeated extremes. Pilots developed thousand-yard stares. They wrote home less. They drifted around base like ghosts. They understood. Probabilities, you can defy mathematics once. Maybe twice. Eventually the ocean wins. Some skeleton bombers never returned. They did not fall in dramatic combat. They simply vanished. An engine failure over the Timor Sea. A minor navigational error in darkness. A failed fuel transfer pump. Then silence. Static on the radio and nothing more. By 1944, the strategic picture shifted. American forces captured islands closer to Japan. New airfields were built. The B-29 superfortress arrived, pressurized and technologically advanced, capable of flying farther and faster than Liberators. The skeleton aircraft became unnecessary. Survivors were parked at field edges and abandoned. Jungle crept over them. Vines crawled across wings. Plywood patches rotted away. Paper planes that once burned the heart of an empire became scrap or rusting relics. Crews returned home. The shift was abrupt. 1 week they were pumping fuel by hand at 15,000 feet, freezing and afraid. The next they walked down American streets buying milk and newspapers. Flight jackets were replaced by suits and ties. They resumed lives as farmers, accountants, and mechanics. They sat in diners listening to complaints about gasoline rationing, knowing they had burned more fuel in one night than many civilians would use in decades. They rarely spoke about skeleton missions. Explaining them felt impossible. How do you describe stripping armor to survive? How do you explain feeling safer without guns? How do you convey 17 hours? Alone over open ocean knowing rescue was unlikely? It sounded reckless. So they carried the memory quietly. Cold, fumes, fear locked inside. But the legacy of the Lone Rangers is more than a historical footnote. It is a lesson in innovation. In war, the greatest weapon is not technology alone. It is the willingness to challenge assumptions. Engineers built an aircraft to satisfy a manual. Soldiers rebuilt it to satisfy reality. They examined an impossible distance and bridged it, not with revolutionary engines or secret devices, but with tools and resolve. Next time you study a map of the Pacific, trace the line from Australia to Borneo. Imagine flying that distance inside a hollow metal tube through absolute darkness. Imagine endless ocean beneath you. Imagine refinery lights appearing on the horizon. Remember the skeleton crews who flew into darkness so others could see light. If this account of a bomber that defied convention resonated, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe so you do not miss future explorations of overlooked history. Share in the comments another example of battlefield improvisation that altered the course of war. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering the Lone Rangers. Stay safe and keep flying.